Miigwech Roger, and I want to thank Roger for inviting me here. It was quite a while ago that he asked me to attend, and I was really enthusiastic and honored to be invited. So Miigwech, and thank you for having me here today. It is a good crowd for the last day and the day after the gala event, and I was really disappointed I couldn't make it last night. Just really haven't been feeling well this week, and I've been traveling actually since October 1st, so I think it's starting to get the better of me. And I've been really open that I have lupus, so sometimes the travel kind of catches up with me. So I apologize I wasn't there last night, but I understand it was a fabulous evening. So I don't have anything to disclose, but I do obviously really want to again acknowledge this land, this territory of the Bunduk people, and thank you again for having me here. It's been a really wonderful week, some fantastic presentations, and for me it's really an amazing opportunity to be able to not only meet new people, but for me to be able to take in that information and sit and listen and learn, because we always have to be remain humble, right, and learn and take that in, and I love that opportunity to be able to do that, because so often I find myself running from meeting to meeting to meeting, and to have this opportunity to be here and listen and learn, it's been amazing. I want to thank you for that opportunity. So I was asked to come and share some information about the institute that I'm the scientific director of. I'm in my second year now, still pinching myself a little bit, because it's certainly not something I ever thought that I would be doing in a million years. I'm a community-based researcher. I've always been a community-based researcher. I've always served communities. That's my role. And when I became the scientific director, it really was at the urging of community for me to apply to the position. And so I had to really rethink that. How was I going to continue to serve community in a very different role now that I'm creating funding opportunities for Indigenous communities across Canada? But it's been a very interesting 2 years, a good 2 years, and certainly a learning curve for me. So I'll certainly speak to that, but I wanted to start just by talking a little bit about Canada and sort of juxtaposing some of the issues that we're experiencing in terms of Indigenous health in Canada, and a lot of the similarities with Australia. So in Canada, the Indigenous population is about 4.9%. I understand it's about 3.3% in Australia. The total Indigenous population, we have a very diverse Indigenous population in Canada. It is, of course, very diverse in Australia as well. But in Canada, we have a Métis population. And yesterday, you probably were here at the panel. If you were here, you saw there was a Métis Nation representative from Ontario, and so that made me very proud. I'm Métis. There's about 587,000 Métis people in Canada. That's probably underrepresented. I think that we're really just starting to truly understand how many Métis people there are in Canada. There's about 977,000 First Nations people and about 65,000 Inuit people. Since 2006, the Indigenous population has grown. I guess I should, if I'm going to juxtapose, I should go back and forth. In Australia, there's about 786,000 Indigenous people in Australia. And since 2011, the Indigenous population has grown by 17.4% in Australia. In Canada, since 2006, the Indigenous population has grown by 42.5%. Two of the main factors in Canada for the reasons of growth is natural growth, increased life expectancy, and relatively high fertility rates, but also just in terms of self-reported identification. In Australia, the reasons is growing visibility of Indigenous Australians and natural growth as well as that is similar really to Canada, really natural growth and self-identification. In terms of some of the, what health and wellness factors and life expectancy, in Canada, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, cancer, stroke, suicide, motor vehicle accidents, and homicide are some of the major causes of death and some of the issues that we deal with. Life expectancy for First Nations in particular was estimated at 68.9 years for males and 76.6 years for females. And I want to say that for Métis people, we do not have accurate data. We don't have accurate birth rates, we don't have accurate death rates, we don't even have accurate data for chronic diseases and infectious diseases. We just don't have accurate data. I actually did my doctorate degree on Métis health status, and it was one of the first ever pieces of literature that actually sort of demonstrated that Métis health was poorer than the rest of Canadians, and that was shocking to me. And we still do not have accurate data for Métis people. And I just think that, when people call us the invisible people in Canada, they call Métis people the invisible population. We are. When you don't have data, you are invisible. And, we don't have adequate services for Métis people. We don't have adequate culturally safe services for Métis people in Canada. And that's because, we don't have data. It is starting to get better. The government is starting now to finally recognize Métis people, but we're not there yet. Data for Inuit people is a little bit better. It is not great. And so, you can see that there's disparities between the three populations in Canada. In Australia, between 2012 and 2016, the 5 leading causes of death for Indigenous Australians were coronary heart disease, diabetes, COPD, and lung cancer, as well as suicide. So some similarities there as well. Life expectancy of Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people estimated at 69.1 years for males and 73.7 years for females. Again, fairly similar rates for Australian Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous people really continue to suffer from high rates of chronic and infectious disease and higher mortality rates and infant mortality rates compared to the general Canadian population and the Indigenous Australian population. That just continues on. So we do make some strides, but certainly we're not really closing the gap either in Canada or Australia. And you can see the data there. In Canada, about 50% of the Aboriginal population, I prefer the term Indigenous, but this is coming from Stats Canada, where they still use the term Aboriginal. They live in rural and remote and northern regions. About 63% of Aboriginal communities in Canada have fewer than 500 residents. Most of those communities are Inuit communities, where they have an average of fewer than 1,000 people living in the community. And about 10% of Métis people live on settlement lands, and so many of those live in non-settlement and rural, northern, and remote communities as well. So in Australia, about 35% of Australia Indigenous people live in major cities, with 65% living in regional and remote areas, and 71% of Australia's non-Indigenous people live in major cities, and 29% live in regional or remote areas. So we have a lot of Aboriginal people living in rural and remote areas, and that means less access to health services. So in terms of the overall state of Indigenous people's health, we know in Canada preventable diseases due to circulatory diseases make up 23% of all deaths, and injury makes up 22% of all deaths, and these are preventable. So that means that accounts for 50% of all deaths. These are preventable diseases. Preventable deaths, I mean. So 50%. This is something I point out in every presentation I do, because this is something that we can actually stop. But it continues to happen in our Indigenous communities. For First Nations, ages 1 to 44, the most common cause of death is injury and poisoning. And the primary cause of death for children less than 10 years of age was classified as unintentional or accidents. So again, preventable deaths that continue to occur. And suicide rates for Aboriginal youth range from 5 to 7 times higher than the national average in Canada. And the potential years of lost life from injury alone was more than all other causes of death, at almost 3.5 times that of the general Canadian population. And I could have 20 slides for this, but I only put one statistic in here. The mortality rate due to violence for Aboriginal women is 3 times the rate experienced by all other Canadian women. And you probably are well aware that in Canada, we have well over 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, and it's, even though we've just had a missing and murdered Indigenous women's inquiry, really, it just continues. And Indigenous women are by far the most marginalized population in Canada. For Indigenous Australians, they're twice as likely to die from coronary heart disease and nearly 3 times to die from COPD. Half of the deaths for people aged less than 75 were avoidable deaths, so very similar to what I just described for Indigenous Canadians. And in 80% of youth suicides aged 10 to 24 in 2011, the victim was Indigenous. And in 2014-15, Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander women reported experiencing physical or threatened violence in previous 12 months at 3.1 times the rate of non-Indigenous women. So again, very similar trends to Indigenous women in Canada. So what are some of the root causes of this? I talk about this every single presentation because I really think it's the elephant in the room, and I started to talk about this a little bit yesterday on the panel. But we really have got to start talking about systemic racism, because I really believe racism is killing Indigenous people, not only in Canada, but in other countries, including Australia. And this is rooted in colonial systems. So, I mean, I think we just have to start talking about it, because unless we really start to address it, this is going to continue to happen. Because disparities in health really exist on the basis of race. It does, full stop. And so racism and oppression are rooted in the historical legacies of colonized countries, and that includes Australia. So in Canada, we know that historical legacies are perpetuated. They're perpetuated in Canada through our Indian Act, and that Indian Act is not something that we can just say is historical and say, well, we just need to get over it, which we hear a lot of. That Indian Act not only has created historical trauma that we are still getting over and trying to deal with and address and work through that trauma, we have that an Indian Act still in place today. And I don't think we've even begun to think about how that historical trauma that we are addressing, from residential school legacy and many other policies. I mean, for those who didn't attend residential school, there are many other impacts of colonization. And so as we're addressing those impacts of colonization, we still have an Indian Act that affects us every single day. And I don't think we've even thought about how that trajectory, that intersection between the historical legacies and the continued oppression is impacting us on an everyday basis. And remembering that every single social construct, whether it's an educational system, whether it's a healthcare system, was rooted in a colonial construct. And how do we even begin to think about deconstructing that? How are we going to talk about accessing culturally safe care if we don't admit that the healthcare system itself is racist, that there's bias, that it's discriminatory? Because that's really, really hard to admit. It doesn't mean that every person is racist. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the healthcare system is inherently racist because it's rooted in a colonial construct. And we have to start admitting that and understanding how do we begin to deconstruct that. It is about anti-racism and anti-discrimination. So Indigenous peoples carry an inordinate burden of ill health, and we suffer the worst health of any group in Canada. And I think the same could be said for Indigenous Australians. So beyond the fact that Indigenous people experience the poorest living conditions and inequitable access to education and food and employment, healthcare services, in a country that reliably ranks in the top 10 of the United Nations Human Development Index, I mean, that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. So this inequitable access leads to the worst health outcomes, but most importantly, racism is identified as the major factor in creating and reinforcing the disparities. And the racism that, as I have identified, is rooted in our colonial history and the processes that have continued to disconnect us from our own communities, from our own lands, from our own languages. So Indigenous peoples, while we are disconnected from our own lands and our languages, and we are doing our very best to reconnect, to reclaim, to deconstruct, we are very resilient. We are still here. And so at the same time that we're trying to address the intergenerational trauma, we have to remember the strengths that we have. And that's really one of the priorities of the Institute of Indigenous Peoples Health. Because if we continue to focus only on the deficits and undertake deficit research, that really is not going to benefit Indigenous communities. So we have really taken the approach that we're going to focus on the strengths and the resilience and the resourcefulness that Indigenous communities have, particularly in terms of a research agenda. Before I get to that, some of the unaddressed challenges and the possible solutions when it comes to northern and rural Indigenous communities. In Canada, we do have quite a few Indigenous communities that do live in urban settings. I think it's now 66% of First Nations now live in urban settings. But having said that, we do still have a high number of Indigenous communities that live in rural and remote settings, and particularly Inuit communities. They live in mostly in rural and remote and northern areas. So here are some of the possible solutions for northern and rural Indigenous communities. It's really important to have access to culturally safe and equitable health care. And not just, as I said, geographical access. I think this is something that academia and healthcare providers have been working on for many, many years. So geographical access is obvious. I don't think it even has to be stated. But going back to what I was just discussing around systemic racism, providing culturally safe care is particularly important because for many Indigenous people, they won't even access care if they feel like they're going to be discriminated against, if they're going to experience bias and stigma and racism. And by the time that they do decide to access care, they might now have multiple conditions, multiple chronic diseases, or maybe at end stage life, because they often don't have a primary care physician, and many will use the emergency department, for example, as their primary care physician, and that's by the time that they get there, now they're in some real trouble. Now they have many more issues to address than they would have if they would have felt comfortable and safe to access care. And this is particularly an issue if they're living in a rural and remote area. Self-governance and capacity building in this regard is extremely important. Ensuring that communities have a voice in what their healthcare looks like, and especially when they're in a small setting, or a small town setting, or a small rural remote setting. Enhancing partnerships and collaboration to address jurisdictional issues, and this is particularly important for First Nations communities in Canada. Investing in technology, I mean, this is not a new idea. This is obviously something that is particularly an ongoing issue. I think that we started talking about this my first year in working with First Nations University, because technology has been an issue in rural and remote settings for the past 25 years, and I don't think it's been solved yet, but we have to continue to work on this. It is an absolute priority. Increased research, but not just research, participatory, community-based research that the communities are driving, because we cannot undertake research for research's sake any longer. The research has to be something that translates into services, into policies, into practice that benefits the communities. So the research in this context absolutely must benefit the rural, northern, and remote communities that we're serving. Including traditional medicine and holistic approaches to health and healing in addition to Western medicine, that this absolutely is a priority, particularly in the context of what I'm describing around the trust issues when it comes to Western medicine and access to medicine. Needing a real national strategy to access healthy and affordable food in northern, remote, and rural communities. And mental health and wellness, particularly community strategies around this, and addressing the social determinants of health through self-determination. None of those are easy things, obviously. I don't want it to sound like it's some careless, easy kind of strategy. I want to just turn to research for a few moments here. I think research has a real role to play in developing strategies, and particularly in rural and remote communities, because I've seen it work. I've seen research transform communities and transform into practices and programs and services. And so I think, I don't think actually in this, I can go through this fairly quickly, because I don't think in this setting, any of you really need to hear what I have to say around research as exploitation, except to say that unfortunately it still happens. Helicopter research still is occurring in communities. I'm still getting complaints from communities and advice on how to stop it. And it's shocking that in 2018, I still have to go to conferences and talk about the fact that exploitation is still occurring within Indigenous communities. And to have to say that experimentation on Indigenous peoples happened, and that some communities are still afraid to engage in research, and some communities don't want to engage in research because of the experimentation that happened in their communities. That research is being conducted without consent, that traditional knowledge is being shared by incredible elders and knowledge keepers, and then being taken out of their communities without their consent. And that research is being undertaken that is not beneficial to communities. I don't think that anybody in this room would have to really hear that, but just so that you know that this unfortunately is still happening in Canada. And I don't know if it's happening in Australia, but it has been happening in Canada. So I won't spend a lot of time on this slide either. It's, again, just more sort of grievances that we hear in Canada, and we're really, at CHR, very much trying to address this through different research protocols. The concepts that I have been using as a researcher now for about 18 years, I guess, are the concepts of reciprocity, the collective, the idea that I serve community and that we think of things not in an independent way. We think of things truly as a collective, as a community. And community can be defined in many ways, and we've heard that from the excellent keynotes here this week, that community is defined in multiple ways. Sometimes a community for us is an organization. I work with, for example, with All Nations Hope in Regina. It's a HIV organization that works with Indigenous women in an urban setting. Sometimes a community is a First Nation. Sometimes a community was my Métis local. It really depends on who you're working with, but community is defined in different ways. Building relationships. I have relationships with communities that I have known for 15 years, some for 12. I don't think I'm working with the community right now that I haven't known for 10 years or more. When you work in this kind of field, they are long-term commitments, right? You don't walk away from the communities unless they tell you they're done with you, right? And when I say I serve communities, that's exactly what I do. They are the ones that direct every aspect of the research process, from what it is that they want to see in the community, what the issue is, to whether or not they want to do the coding or not. Margaret at All Nations Hope, she does not like doing the research coding, and she hands that off to us. But that's their choice, because this is their work and their needs, not mine. So it really truly is about what they want. Giving back in a real way, right? We're trained in Western academia very, very differently from what this process is, what Indigenous research methodologies is, and privileging Indigenous knowledge. And we think in a different way. Holism is a mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual, and making sure that spiritual piece is involved, not just in asking an elder to say a prayer. That's cosmetic, but in a very real way. So we start everything with spirit, with ceremony. The elders guide us. We have an elders committee, and elders are very involved in all aspects of the research. So this isn't just some sort of cosmetic kind of thing. They are very, very much involved and give us all kinds of direction. Responsibility. I feel a huge responsibility as the researcher, wearing a researcher hat, which is 50% of my time, by the way, so I'm not in conflict when I'm scientific director. But I'm very much understand the responsibility I have if I'm bringing community into the realm of academia, that I have a responsibility to ensure I break down those barriers to ensure that I pay the honorariums in a respectful manner to the elders, or that I don't bring them into that academic space that isn't safe for them. That is my responsibility to do that. It is my responsibility to ensure that we create that culturally safe space. It is my responsibility. It is not their responsibility. So ensuring that I'm very clear about my responsibilities, and if you're going to engage in this kind of research, that is now your responsibility as an academic to do that. Creating that space and that mutual respect. We don't. It's hard for me as an Indigenous person because I am an academic, but I'm also from the community, and we don't expect you to understand or learn all of our protocols, but it is just about that mutual respect. That's the space that we're looking for. And so I guess that's that space that when you're entering into relationships and building relationships, I guess that's what I wanted to communicate about what respect means in that space. And then there's processes, what capacity building means for communities. Every community is going to expect something different, but it's about what they need. And yes, sometimes CHR is going to say, how many graduate students did you train? That's important, but what's more important is about what did the community want, and what does capacity building mean for them? Community control, true community control, is the academic giving up their control. And that really has to happen. Community engagement in a real way, not just, oh, well, we got the chief to sign off on it. That's important, but true community engagement takes a very long time, and that is more important than any kind of piece of paper, because that's where you'll get the real work done, is within the community engagement. And collaboration, of course, I think that's self-reflective, and cultural responsiveness. Making sure that whatever comes out of the research is culturally safe, culturally responsive to that community. In Canada, we, of course, have the Tri-Council policy. I think there's something similar in each country, but we often use the ownership, control, access, and possession, which was developed by First Nations. And I think you're going to see more and more cultural or ethical protocols come from Métis. I think, I know the Inuit are developing their own as well. And these are, I guess, central to each community, and I think you're going to, it might become complicated, but you know, that's just how it is. You're going to see ethical protocols come forward as communities develop them. Some First Nations communities have their own ethics boards as well, and I think we're going to see more and more of those come forward, and I welcome them. But OCAP really asserts that that First Nations governance and self-government implies jurisdiction and really control over a range of institutions and processes that includes research. And this really, really is about nation building at the end of the day. That's what it's about. It's about self-governance. And ownership, control, access, and possession are principles that you would negotiate through a research agreement. And again, because they're principles, every agreement that you develop is going to be different. So it is really, to me, about self-determination. So I just want to, I don't have not much time left, so I just want to switch over and talk now a little bit about CIHR's commitments. When I came into the role, we had an action plan that I'm committed to. There's a 10-point action plan, as you can see. A couple of the important points is that we had to develop a new definition of what Indigenous health research was and develop performance indicators. I think the biggest one, though, is that we are committed to increasing investments to a minimum of 4.6%. And that's why we had to develop the new definition of what constitutes health research, so that we can count where we were at. And where we were at when we started was, well, here's our definition, I guess I should do that. So our definition for health research is defined by any field or discipline related to health and wellness, conducted by, grounded in, or engaged with First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities, societies or individuals, and their wisdom, cultures, experiences, or knowledge systems as expressed in their dynamic forms past and present. And you can imagine how long that took us to come up with that definition that we could agree on. But we have it now. And so when we started, when we finally counted what was Indigenous health research, we were at about, I think it was about 1.8%. And I think we're up to around 3% now, which is not great. But we are making progress. We're getting there, and we have more work to do for sure. But we are using our definition now. We're moving forward, and and continuing to work hard so that we can, I actually want to go higher than 4.6%, and I want to push them that as our population grows, we adjust that number. So we have a reference group for the appropriate review of Indigenous health research, and I really have to credit my predecessors, Dr. Jeff Redding, Dr. Malcolm King, because we would not be able to do this work without them creating the pathways for this. And since 2016, we've been really working very hard to create this reference group. We are going to be having elders on our reference group for the first time in CIHR history, and I'm really excited about this. It's comprised of Indigenous health research leaders, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and with advice from the reference group, CIHR has implemented what's called an iterative peer review process. And this iterative peer review process has really helped to increase the success of Indigenous research submissions. Because we were having a lot of complaints about peer review process, right? That peer reviewers did not understand community-based research, they did not understand Indigenous methodologies, we weren't getting the right peer reviewers on peer review, and so we really had to create an appropriate process for Indigenous health research. So the reference group has also helped us establish review principles that are relevant to Indigenous health research. So for example, the significance and impact. The proposed research must be relevant to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis priorities and have the potential to produce valued outcomes from the perspective of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis participants and peoples more broadly. So you can see how we've made sure that that it's very clear that this has to be an Indigenous priority. So I want to just really quickly walk you through what iterative peer review looks like when you apply for a project grant. So for applicants, you have to address the TCPS2, the Tri-Council Policy Statement, which is the ethical guidelines that CIHR endorses. You can also, in addition, say that you're going to use the OCAP principles, the ownership, control, access, possession. And so that you start with that. And then the assignment of the application goes to the Indigenous Health Research Commitment Mandate, and it's assessed. If it's not relevant, the application is then assigned to an alternate committee. So if it's relevant to our committee, you're assessed. The applications are then reviewed with a mentorship lens, and all applications are now reviewed face-to-face, because for a while that face-to-face was all of a sudden all online, and that didn't work well for us. And then after the review, the applications may fall into one of four categories, category decisions. And those category decisions are these. It's either fully fundable right off the bat, or it could have conditional funding. So for applications that are seen as promising but might have limitations in either the scientific or the community engagement approach, that if it's addressed in a short amount of time with minor revisions, then they'll get the conditional funding. So they'll do their revisions, come back 6 months later, and then they'll get their full funding. They may also get bridge funding, and this could be allocated post-review if the funds permit, and that's based on ranking. And finally, they just may not be funded, it's just not good enough, and they're not funded. So that iterative review, we've used this process 3 times, and we've had really good success. So much so that we've had requests from other committees if we can use iterative peer review. And I said, well, you've got to go to CIHR headquarters and ask them. That's not up to me. But it has been really, really successful for us. So for our next steps for the reference group, we're going to formalize our terms of reference. We're nearly finished. We're going to launch an expression of interest in the fall to renew our membership. And again, I'm so excited because we're going to have 2 elders on this reference committee. And we're aiming for a really increased diverse members of First Nation, Inuit, Métis, geographic variation, and different levels of experience. We want different career stages, so we have some early stage career members as well. I just want to finish up by just letting you know what some of our priorities are as an institute. We just finished our community engagement, and our strategic plan will be launched because I'm a community person. And so it feels odd for me to say, well, I think we should do this funding opportunity or this funding opportunity. It really has to come from communities. So the community engagement, when we went across the country asking grassroots and stakeholders, NIOs, the National Indigenous Organizations, what we heard was that communities wanted self-determination, to be able to hold funds and to ensure that communities were directing the research agenda. We didn't get a big laundry list of issues. We didn't get, diabetes is important, or HIV/AIDS is important. We didn't get that. We want to direct the agenda, right? So that didn't really surprise me, having worked in community for so many years. So we're excited to launch our plan, and so what we have done is had very broad principles, and that has been guiding us in terms of the kinds of funding opportunities we've been launching. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You can see here that we are committed to mentoring the next generation. We are committed to knowledge translation and Indigenous research. We are committed to transforming the agenda by prioritizing Indigenous ways of knowing and the guiding principle of reciprocal learning. I say this in every presentation as well. There's three things I always say, and that is that Indigenous knowledge is science, and we have got to prioritize Indigenous research methodologies, full stop. And we have to advocate and really start to prioritize Indigenous ways of knowing and transforming them into interventions, and really go beyond the advanced notions of health equity and give primacy to wellness, strength, and resilience. And so collaborating with international bodies, we have signed an LOI with Australia and New Zealand, and one of our first projects is we'll be having a mentorship workshop in New Zealand. We're hoping for next November, so stay tuned for details. We're really keen to ensure that we grow the Indigenous health workforce. And of course, one of the other aspects is we really want to identify indicators to measure and monitor wellness and transform research into policy and practice. So one of the large initiatives that we launched this past year is a 16-year, $100.8 million investment called the NEARS, the Network Environments for Indigenous Health Research. This builds on a program that Dr. Jeff Redding launched when he was first scientific director. It's a network that is a community-based research network. There's going to be one NEAR in every province and 2 in the north in Canada, and we've never had any in the north. It is about training and research and community-based research, and it is going to be driven by Indigenous communities. And we know it works. I was a member of the NEAR. I would not be here without the NEARs and without the mentorship through the NEARs. And so we are extremely excited about this initiative. And we're really, really focused on the mentorship of a new generation of researchers. And it prioritizes Indigenous research methodologies. So the NEARs are something that is going to be a legacy for, I think, Indigenous health researchers in Canada. And it will really prioritize Indigenous paradigms. So we launched 24 development grants, and there's going to be 9 full network grants, as I said, and a consortium grant that will be a national, international NEAR for Canada. And the last thing that I'll talk about is something called the HELTI. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's the Indigenous HELTI. And this is a Healthy Life Trajectories to address and improve health outcomes across the lifespan for Indigenous boys, girls, women, men, gender diverse, and two-spirit individuals in Canada. And it takes a DOHAT approach, which is a life trajectory approach, to focus on non-communicable diseases, disease prevention, diabetes, obesity, and mental wellness. And so that's a 10-year initiative that is just launching as well. And that's it for me. I think I've taken up a lot of your time, and I'm really excited to see if you have any questions, and happy to have had the opportunity to speak. Miigwech.
Fantastic. That was really wonderful work, wasn't it? Wow. I suspected that some of us weren't fully awake at the beginning of this plenary, but what a wake-up call. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Carrie. You not only hit us, shall we say, between the eyes with the issues and the problems, the challenges, which then turn to the opportunities for developing research owned and operated, guided by Indigenous peoples, and then shared with us the important initiatives which you're leading through the CIHR in Canada. Just fantastic, thank you. Now we have a little time for questions and comments, and I can see there's one up here. Maybe Claudette, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was amazing. I never wanted to do research. I like clinical medicine, but the community I work for is driving me into it. They've asked, and I want to show up. So, but one of the challenges I'm finding is dealing with the ownership, and I absolutely support that the community owns whatever we come up with, but granting agencies don't necessarily agree. And I wondered if you had any tips on how to work around that.
Sure. Right, so I think I've been blessed. CIHR really understands what ownership actually means, and I think it's about negotiating that space and understanding that communities understand about that the funding agencies don't fully understand what ownership really means. Ownership doesn't mean that they're not going to let you publish. Ownership doesn't mean that they're never going to let you see the data. And in fact, most communities, they don't even have the capability yet to hold data. So the fact is that it's really about negotiating that space and just having the conversations about what does ownership mean, and creating research agreements and data ownership agreements that really between the parties that they'll understand. Because the fact is, they're probably going to say to you, we actually can't hold the data. We need you to be the steward, right? And we in fact want the data to be published, but we may not want this piece to be published because it's going to harm our community. It's all about the relationship building, the discussion, and really getting the funding agency to come along and understand what those words actually mean, right? Because I think sometimes it just scares people when you say ownership, right? And we just, not to belabor it, but we just had this big conversation with a brand new funding agency, which is not a tri-council agency. It took us 2 months, but we got there. Yeah.
Okay, another question or comment? We've got one down here somewhere, have we? Here we are.
Thanks very much, Carrie. John Wakeman. In Australia, we see quite a range of sophistication in terms of approach to research, particularly from community-controlled health services. So some of the larger ones have a very sophisticated approach to research, are able to work with a range of research agencies to do the sort of work that they want done. Some of the smaller services are interested in research but just don't have the the capacity to engage with researchers effectively because they're short-staffed, staff are coming and going and so forth. So is this an issue for you in Canada, and how do you work to help to build the capacity for services and communities to engage with researchers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a challenge. We have some really research savvy communities, some that aren't as such. So on the CHR side of things, actually, we're actually working with the Métis National Council because we notice that we don't get as many Métis applications. And they actually said straight out to us, we would like you to work with us and do some capacity building workshops because we just don't have the capacity to do this. So we're doing that in the fall on the CHR side of things. I expect we're going to get similar requests now that we're doing that from other communities. As a researcher, when I'm asked, because I don't ever presume that I'm going to walk into a community and I just don't do that. Communities approach me, and when they approach me, I do what they ask me to do. So as a researcher, when I'm asked to do that, then I bust my butt to go out and find the funds to help build the the capacity that they've asked me to do. Sometimes it's harder than others to do that, and as you say, with turnover, it can be hard. But All Nations Hope is a really good example of that. When we started with All Nations Hope, it was a handful of people, but the only mainstay has been the CEO, and now they're one of the strongest research organizations in Saskatchewan. I don't take any credit for that. I take the fact that they asked me to come and help, and they were serious, and they felt that research could really transform their organization. So I guess just the fact that they asked, they persevered, and I think they had the right leadership to do it. I guess just for me, taking directions is all I could do, and we pieced together we started with a $25,000 grant, and we engaged community, and the more community saw the benefit, the more they wanted to engage. That's the best advice I can give. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hi. Ooh, sorry. Everybody's awake now. I'm Ruth Stewart. I live and work in the Torres Strait in far north Queensland, almost in Papua New Guinea. I sit on a safety and quality committee for our hospital and health service, and to begin to explore the concepts of how much community control there is in the research in our area, we first of all asked, of the research permission requests we had, how many of the researchers had reported back to, we can monitor to the health service, but we are the only health service in our area. And we figured that probably reflected how much reporting back to the community had occurred. It was less than 2%. So I'm going to come and talk with you about some ways to actually push. We're beginning, but we've got committees, but it's a scary situation. It was a comment, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, you're not alone. It happens in Canada. Yeah.
Oh, we've got another question up here. Yeah.
Hi, Carrie. Janice Willett. Just some advice about the tension that occurs in research institutes and academia to produce, to publish or perish, versus the altruistic nature of the type of research we have to engage in with Indigenous communities. How have you bridged that? Because I'm sure you've experienced it before.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And actually, I presented last year at a conference, and this came up. And it has been difficult, even at First Nations University, where we were supposed to do that kind of work, and it was supposed to be counted. I still ended up, often publishing other things off the side of my desk so that I could make my tenure and all of that. But it's something that I thought about coming in as scientific director, and we're actually starting to address it at CHR, particularly for early career and for, we're thinking now about graduate students and building careers and what they have to do. And what I've heard from them is, well, we have to go out and build relationships, and we're doing ceremony, and we're doing this, and none of it counts. And so I've been bringing up the idea of we have to think about what counts. And yes, grades count, and yes, publications count, and all those things. But I think that if, at least for my institute, I can control what I do in my institute. And so I've actually talked to senior management, and I can't promise anything yet, but I did get a good response where I said, we have to start thinking about what counts. And if we lead the way, it's going to put pressure on academia. So what we're going to try and do for our next round of student funding is say that yes, grades count, yes, your publications count, but you know what else counts is what else you're doing. What kind of community engagement are you doing? Because that's going to count. And when we start to do that, then it is going to put pressure on academia. And then I went back to the University of Saskatchewan, where I just started, and I said, guess what I think should count for some of our students? And then they said, well, why wouldn't we get this to start counting for some of our faculty? So if I can get, us to start leading the way a little bit, and if I can get my own home institution to start leading the way, maybe this will start, to spread a little bit, because we have to start talking about it, because it counts. How many hours do we spend in communities building relationships that leads to those grants, that leads to those publications? That, it counts. It has to count. And so I think we have to start having those conversations, and we have to start pushing back a little bit. So if I can, in a small way, start to lead that movement, then maybe it will take off and spread in other parts of the world as well. So if you want to keep up with how I'm doing, and then maybe start a movement here, please, by all means, because it has to count. It has to.
Okay, I have a feeling this conversation can and possibly will continue through the rest of the morning, but we've run out of time for this particular plenary session, so you'll have to continue your discussions with Carrie separate from this plenary. As we come to a close, on your behalf, I want to again say thank you very much for an outstanding presentation.